So another day in the search for Alabama's next head coach continues, and today we need to wade through the rumor mill. We need to discuss the names that have been so often attributed to the job and talk about the pros and cons of each and how realistic I think they all might be. Before we can, as always, y'all know the drill, I have got to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no, and would you be excited if Kalen DeBoer got the head coaching job at the University of Alabama? I ask because his name is one that so often pops up in these reports. Want to hear from all of you. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it. And if you enjoyed the content, be sure to like and comment down below. But having said all that, let's jump right in. And yesterday started off with so many people hopeful that Dan Lanning could be the guy. However, it did not take long for Dan Lanning to quell those rumors. After that, so many people were asking themselves what comes next. Well, luckily, there is still a healthy list of names that are being attributed to the University of Alabama head coaching job. We can talk about Kalen DeBoer, the individual who we asked in the question segment of the intro, how you guys would feel about DeBoer being hired by the University of Alabama. Let's talk about him. This is a guy that has only known success wherever he has been. His overall record at Washington is 25-3. His overall head coaching record is 104-12. He has been able to beat teams far more talented than him with far less talented teams. And whenever we talk about some of the other names attributed to the Alabama job, you're talking about names like Dan Lanning, who a lot of Alabama fans were excited about because of his upside, because of his recruiting ability. Another name that Alabama fans wanted bad is Steve Sarkisian because of the connections to the University of Alabama. He's been in the SEC, he understands SEC recruiting, and now he's been in the state of Texas, and that state is as talented as any state in the nation. Well, the reason why I bring up Steve Sarkisian's name and Dan Lanning's name as we're talking about Kalen DeBoer is because those two individuals are names that when I'm looking around, I see Bama fans much more excited about Sark or Dan Lanning. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, those two coaches are 0-5 against Kalen DeBoer, and those two coaches brought the far more talented teams to the table only to be beat time and time again by the Washington Huskies. Kalen DeBoer beat Dan Lanning 3 times. He beat Steve Sarkisian twice. So this is a guy that wins wherever he goes. The only question so many people have about Kalen DeBoer comes in 2 parts. First and foremost, he doesn't have any affiliation to the Southeastern Conference. Secondly, he hasn't been able to achieve top 10 recruiting classes. Now, my caveat to the second one is I don't think it's necessarily very easy to recruit to the University of Washington. I don't think Washington has the same recruiting prowess that the Alabama Crimson Tide does. My caveat to the first point where he doesn't have ties to the Southeastern Conference, that one is a little bit deeper because that one I absolutely understand people's hold up there. The SEC football is an absolute gauntlet. The SEC schedule is an absolute gauntlet. And having somebody that has an understanding of that gauntlet, that absolutely helps. I think a lot of Alabama fans want a coach that has SEC experience, and that's fair. But what I will say is if you surround him with guys on your staff, your supporting roles, which are what those people are there for, with individuals who do understand the SEC landscape, I think you mitigate a lot of those concerns. But let's move forward. Another name that so many people have wanted is Steve Sarkisian. However, yesterday we got some tweets not only from Steve Sarkisian but his wife that would indicate that he plans on staying in Austin. And look, this makes sense. The University of Texas is one of those universities that can match anybody in the country dime for dime. And if they wanted to keep Steve Sarkisian, they were just going to hand him a blank check and say, fill it out yourself. So I'm not inherently surprised that Sark chooses to stay at Austin. He's got a good thing going there. He's going to be viewed as the guy that's turning Texas from the fire that they were into a positive direction, and that alone is a compelling factor. We move forward to some other names. Mike Norvell is a name that got a lot of press up until the reports dropped about the sanctions that are going to be levied against Florida State. Now, it is important to note that those sanctions don't pertain to Mike Norvell, and thus far he has been cleared, but it was just interesting timing of it all. Mike Norvell is someone who has been successful at Florida State. He has been able to rebuild that program, a program that when he took it over was not in the greatest position. Now, the big question with Mike Norvell is, will you be able to make that transition successfully from running a Florida State to a University of Alabama? That's the big question there, and I think the same question can be levied for anybody we're talking about. Two final names before we jump out of here. First and foremost, you have Lane Kiffin, a guy that so many in the Crimson Tide fan base either want a lot or are totally opposed to hiring. And this is interesting because Lane has ties, like Steve Sarkisian, to the University of Alabama, where he served under Nick Saban as the offensive coordinator and did so quite successfully. But one of the things we talked about yesterday is that Nick Saban's time at Alabama, I think there are so many synonyms we can use, but one of them is consistency. Nick Saban was a beacon of consistency. And I think that Alabama in their coaching search is going to look to continue some of those things Nick Saban was able to implement into the program, consistency being one of them. As much as I love Lane Kiffin, and I think he would be a good hire, the one thing that I can say, he's not necessarily a super consistent coach, or at least he hasn't been up until this point. So it's going to be interesting to see what Alabama does. Now, that being said, Lane Kiffin is able to recruit in the transfer portal, and he understands the NIL game, and he understands the current landscape of college football. He's been in the SEC, and he understands the University of Alabama. So this would not be a bad hire by any stretch of the imagination. It would be interesting to see who he tabbed as the defensive coordinator, though. That's a conversation for a different day. And finally, the last name we're going to talk about is Dabo Sweeney. Now, this is interesting because a few years ago, and more than a few at this point, the overwhelming majority of Crimson Tide Nation would have welcomed Dabo Sweeney back to Alabama with open arms, but how times have changed. Dabo is a great coach. Let's get that understood. Dabo Sweeney is one of the most successful coaches that are in the game of college football. So from that mindset, it wouldn't be a bad hire. However, the big question I have kind of follows in line with what we just talked about with Lane Kiffin. But it's not consistency that I have a question with. Nick Saban was consistent, but I've said this time and time again. The greatest attribute I can ascribe to Nick Saban is his ability to adapt. He was the master at adaptation, and we've seen it through so many different changes of college football. Dabo Sweeney seems opposed to change. He seems opposed to adaptation. And the reason why I think that that is an interesting talking point is because right now, college football is changing rapidly. We went from a few years ago to there being no transfer portal to then there being a transfer portal. Then NIL came about. Now there's fights legally about how many times you can transfer, and the NCAA the whole time is sitting on their hands because they know they don't have a whole lot of power here. If they try and challenge some of these cases, they're going to be taken to higher courts, and that's the last thing that the NCAA wants, is judicial oversight into how they operate. They are trying to avoid that at all costs. So right now, the NCAA is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Dabo Sweeney has resisted change to a degree that it has actually costed the performance of the Clemson Tigers. The team that was once a shoo-in to win the ACC no longer. And on top of that, they have not been able to figure out an offense that even compares to what he had under Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence. So Dabo Sweeney's a great coach. He is one of the most successful coaches, and he has won a lot of games. But if he is going to be named the University of Alabama's head coach, he has got to be able to adapt to all of the changing landscapes that we are going to be seeing in college football, because I have bad news for everybody. I don't think the change is done by any stretch of the imagination, but I can't wait to hear from all of you. Who would you like to see as Alabama's next head coach? That's it. See ya.